Some of you might be dealing with a cheating wife right now or have faced it in the past. Feel free to share your story and how you handled it. It could help someone going through the same thing. And let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's get into today's story.
Before I met Helen, life followed a structured, almost mechanical routine. My days were consumed by relentless study, exhausting hospital shifts, and the constant pressure to prove myself. There was little room for anything else. My social life had dwindled to casual conversations with colleagues and the occasional drink with old classmates. Romance seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. While my peers were settling down, starting families, I was buried in anatomy books and medical journals, my world reduced to the sterile white walls of a hospital. Everything changed when I met Helen. She was unlike anyone I had ever encountered. Bold, self-assured, with a presence that demanded attention. At a time when my life was dictated by strict schedules and long nights, she brought a kind of unpredictability I didn't know I needed. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic, someone who could walk into a room and own it without saying a word. More than anything, she understood me. She saw beyond the overworked, sleep-deprived doctor in training and recognized someone worth loving. It felt like fate. But the thing about fate is that sometimes it tricks you into thinking it has your best interests at heart. I was running late again. Rounding the last corner toward home, I checked the time. 3:25. Helen had told me to be back by 3 o'clock. Her sister Tammy and her husband were coming for Thanksgiving dinner, bringing their nearly 90-year-old mother along. Our daughter Megan and her husband Nick were also on their way with our grandson Bobby. Beside me sat a thick manila folder. Nearly $6,000 spent in a month. And for what? The photos and reports showed nothing, but my instincts told me otherwise. Something wasn't right in my marriage. Whether it was intuition or just years of experience, I felt it. My name is Hiram Walker. My mother named me after a man who once gave her a job. I'm 54, in good shape, and a physician balancing a private practice and hospital work. Maybe that was part of the problem. Too many hours, not enough time for my wife. But I love my job, helping people, making them better. Helen and I had been together for nearly 25 years. She was a real estate agent when we met, helping me secure the clinic I later owned. She was older than me, but stunning back then. Over time, she let herself go a little, but I loved her even more now. The years and shared memories had deepened our bond. And yet, something felt off. I cared because I loved her. I always had. She was like an old, trusted baseball glove, one I never wanted to replace, no matter what new ones were offered. Pulling into the underground garage, the Mustang's deep rumble stirred something in me, a reminder of simpler times before rising gas prices and endless responsibilities. As I stepped out, I noticed Kelly Callum, a pharmaceutical tech at the hospital. Years ago, I had helped her get the job and supported her through college. She approached me, eager to show off her car, same model, same color, same wheels as mine. I feigned enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere. She still seemed to seek my approval, as if she were that same 18-year-old girl moving into the building years ago. The conversation was brief, though she noticed something was off. I dismissed it, blaming age, which made her laugh. She assured me I wasn't old, even called me practically perfect, offering a listening ear before disappearing into the hallway. Our apartment spanned the top floor, originally several units merged into one, providing multiple entrances. Instead of facing questions at the front door, I opted for the back, hoping to slip into the gathering unnoticed. I assumed they had already started dinner, but Helen, anticipating my habits, had told me an earlier time. So, despite being late, I was still early. Opening the door quietly, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, just avoiding attention. But then, I saw them. My brother-in-law, Ted, walked into the kitchen like he owned it, placing his hands on Helen as if she belonged to him. She recoiled at first, but when she recognized him, she relaxed, leaning into him. Something inside me twisted. I pulled out my phone, captured a few photos and a short video, then turned away. Entering through the front door, I greeted everyone as if nothing had happened and retreated to my office to think.
I made a terrible mistake, one that cost me my happiness, my marriage, and the love of a man who truly adored me. It all started months ago during a family gathering. My sister Tammy, as usual, claimed she had a headache and disappeared into the guest room, leaving me alone in the kitchen with her husband, Ted. Hiram, my husband, was outside grilling, completely unaware. As Ted and I worked in the cramped kitchen, his hand brushed against me while reaching for a bowl. It had been years since anyone had touched me like that. He apologized, but I responded in a way I shouldn't have, making light of the moment. For a brief second, something shifted. We kissed. It wasn't better than Hiram's kisses, just different. My husband's affection had become predictable over the years, steady, familiar. Ted's felt urgent, as if he needed me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He stopped before it went any further, and I was glad. My sister was his wife, after all. But deep down, I realized something had been missing in my life. Aging had changed everything. Hiram, always active, hadn't aged as fast as I had. He still looked years younger, while I felt invisible, just another woman growing old. Society was kinder to aging men, experienced, distinguished, while women simply faded. Maybe that's why I let myself enjoy those fleeting moments of attention. By Thanksgiving, the incident with Ted was long forgotten. That is, until he walked into the kitchen and grabbed me unexpectedly. I turned, ready to react, but relaxed when I saw it was him. It wasn't serious. It was nothing. Just a meaningless moment before we returned to the routine of family life. Then, Hiram came home. He was later than I had asked, but earlier than I had expected. I knew him too well. His habits, his heart. He would greet everyone, make his apologies, and regret being late, even though his work as a doctor always took priority. Patients came first, and I had long accepted that. But something felt off when he didn't appear in the kitchen right away. Wandering into the living room, I found my family gathered around the TV, mesmerized by the same holiday show we watched every year, as if HD made it any different. I didn't see Hiram, but I knew he was here. Ted gestured toward the office, and I understood. I knocked gently before stepping inside. Hiram sat there, his face drawn, his expression heavy. He wiped his eyes too late. I had already seen the tears. In all our years together, I had never seen him like this. He brushed it off, claiming he had lost someone that day. A patient, he said, a woman named Helen barely hanging on when he left the hospital. He spoke in riddles, his words tangled between medicine and something more personal. For a moment, I believed him. Hiram carried his patient's pain as if it were his own, but something told me this wasn't about the hospital. His hands trembled when I reached for them, his voice unsteady. And then he said it. I think I lost Helen. I thought he meant his patient, but now I wonder if he was talking about me.
Sitting at the table, I clenched my fists under the cloth, trying to keep my rage in check. The weight of my discovery crushed me, but I forced myself to play along. Helen called me over, her voice cheerful, unaware or perhaps fully aware of the storm brewing inside me. I stood, moving mechanically toward the dining room, pretending I wasn't unraveling. I stopped in the bathroom on the way, splashing water on my face. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My jaw was set tight, my eyes cold. I had to pull it together, at least for a few more hours. No one else deserved to have their holiday ruined. Not yet. Taking my seat at the head of the table, I glanced around the room. A gathering of people, none of whom were truly mine. Helen's family, parasites living comfortably in the illusion of togetherness. Only Megan, my daughter, was blood. But even with her, a distance had grown over the years, maybe because of all the time I spent working. I felt closer to Kelly, a young colleague at the hospital, than I did to my own child, and Megan's husband, Nick, useless, jobless, letting my daughter carry all the weight while I footed the daycare bills because he couldn't even manage to take care of his own kid. My grandson, Bobby, bore my name, but I knew why. A tribute split between me and Nick's father, a strategic move to keep the money flowing. I wasn't even mad about the minor recognition. I was mad about the major expenses. I hadn't realized I was gripping the edge of the table so hard that it was shaking. Helen's eyes were on me. Did she sense my anger? Was she wondering if I knew? No. She was too self-assured, too convinced of her own superiority. She always thought she was the smartest in the room, smarter than me, smarter than anyone. I shifted my gaze to Ted, my brother-in-law, my wife's lover. I had once believed there was a mutual respect between us, but I had been wrong. He had fooled me, just like Helen had. His arrogant smirk, the casual way he held Tammy's hand, it was all an act. No one here would ever suspect that this bastard was sleeping with my wife. I forced myself to breathe, to stay in control. But it was getting harder. My fury simmered beneath the surface, and the tension in the room was becoming impossible to ignore. My mother-in-law was too sedated up to notice, and the baby was blissfully unaware, but the rest of them were starting to feel it. Their eyes darted away from mine. They could sense something wasn't right. Then Helen did it. She delivered the final insult. With a forced smile, she smoothed over the awkward silence. "I think my husband is too preoccupied with his patients to truly be present with us tonight," she said lightly. "Ted, why don't you say grace?" I stared at her, the words slicing through my mind like a knife. So that was her theory? That I was too busy, too distracted to play the role of husband and host? That I was absent, so she had found someone to replace me? She wasn't just justifying her actions, she was throwing it in my face. Ted stood, tapping his fork against the crystal glass I had paid for. He smiled around the table, soaking in the attention. Smug bastard. He had probably known this was coming, had rehearsed his little speech. He talked about family, about gratitude, about how we should all share what we have to make the world a better place. I nearly laughed out loud. Of course he'd say that. He was already sharing my wife. I sat in silence, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles turned white. I barely noticed when the food was passed around, barely heard the conversation swirling around me. I was lost in my thoughts until I realized someone was speaking directly to me. "Hiram, do you want me to carve the turkey?" Ted asked. I looked at him, my vision sharpening, focusing. He had no idea what was coming. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" I muttered. Ted chuckled, thinking I was joking. "Well, yes, brother-in-law." That was it. The rage inside me erupted. In one swift motion, I lifted the entire turkey, 45 pounds of it, and hurled it across the table. It hit Ted square in the face, knocking him back in his chair, sending him crashing to the floor. The room fell silent. Gasps echoed around me, but I wasn't done. I grabbed the bowl of mashed potatoes and dumped it over his stunned face, then the gravy, then the sweet potatoes from Helen's hands. "Enjoy," I growled. "You like taking what isn't yours, don't you?" Tammy screamed, rushing to her husband's side, demanding to know what was happening. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled out my phone and walked over to the big screen TV, the one they had all been watching so intently just moments ago. With a few taps, I connected my iPhone. The screen flickered, then played the video. Helen, Ted, in my kitchen. Silence, then chaos. And just like that, Thanksgiving was over. The video exposed everything. Ted grabbing Helen, her leaning into him, proof of their betrayal playing out in front of everyone. The room fell into stunned silence, except for my mother-in-law, too lost in her meal to notice the chaos around her. Eyes darted between Ted and Helen, waiting for an explanation neither of them could give. The weight of the moment settled in. I had no interest in listening to excuses. I told them to come up with a story before I returned and walked out. Helen chased after me, crying, but I took the stairs, knowing she wouldn't be able to keep up. On the third floor, a group of young men lingered in the stairwell. Most moved aside without hesitation, but a few watched me with a mix of amusement and pity. I ignored them and continued downward, reaching the garage. The sight of my Mustang, sleek and reliable, gave me a brief moment of clarity. I had no plan, just the urge to escape. As I reached for the door, a hand on my shoulder startled me. Kelly stood there, smirking as if she had been expecting me. Without asking, she took my keys, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. She drove through the city with ease, handling the car as if it were hers. Every stop, every shift, smooth and precise. But once she hit the freeway, she let loose, pushing past 130 miles per hour. The roar of the engine and the rush of speed drowned out my thoughts. For a moment, I didn't have to think about Helen, about Ted, about what came next. Kelly, always perceptive, knew something was wrong. Without hesitation, she pressed me for answers, understanding before I even said it that it was about Helen. She had always been blunt, unfiltered. She guessed at the situation before I confirmed it, assuming Helen had lost interest, had outgrown our marriage. The reality was worse. Finally, I admitted it. Helen was cheating on me with my brother-in-law. Kelly was stunned, then furious. She didn't hold back. The next step was clear, at least to her. A divorce lawyer, a clean break, an end to all of it. Kelly kept talking, throwing out plans and pushing for action as if she had been waiting for this moment. It almost seemed like she was glad my marriage was falling apart. I remembered how she had lived with Helen and me for a while when her parents nearly divorced. They had managed to save their marriage with time and therapy, but the real question was always the same. Can this marriage be saved? Until that night, I had never truly considered life without Helen. Even when I left the apartment in a rage, I knew I would return. I just needed time to process everything. My plan had been to come back, demand answers, insist on counseling, and make sure Ted was permanently out of our lives. If Tammy stayed with him, that was her decision, just like whether I stayed with Helen was mine. Kelly, however, saw things differently. To her, there was no point in negotiating. She couldn't understand why I would even consider staying in the same house as Helen, let alone sleeping in the guest room. She offered me a place to stay, pushing for immediate separation and a lawyer. I wasn't so sure. My attorney, who handled all my legal matters, could take care of the divorce if needed, but I wasn't ready to make that call yet. First, I needed to gather more information. The private investigator I had hired had been watching for Helen to leave the apartment, but it was clear now that the affair had been happening inside our home. If Helen wasn't ending things with Ted, I needed to know. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Kelly, sensing my frustration, suggested I have my own affair, as if proving a point would somehow balance the betrayal. I ignored the comment. Revenge wasn't what I wanted. I wanted the truth. When I returned home, Helen was at the table with Tammy and Ted. She ran to me immediately, tears-streaked and desperate to explain. Tammy was visibly angry, while Ted, for once, looked ashamed. Ignoring them, I went straight to the bedroom, but Helen followed, pleading for a chance to talk. Back in the dining room, she tried to justify what had happened. According to her, there had never been closeness. Just a slow, dangerous slide into something that never should have happened. She admitted feeling insecure, watching me stay youthful and fit while she felt like she was aging alone. The attention from Ted had made her feel seen again, but it had never been about him. It was about her fear of becoming invisible. She insisted it had meant nothing, that it was a mistake she deeply regretted. If Tammy and Ted could try to work through their problems, she argued, why couldn't we? She begged for another chance, breaking down in tears, willing to do anything to fix things. I stood there, listening, weighing her words. I wasn't sure if I believed her. I wasn't sure if it even mattered. All I knew was that I needed time. Without another word, I turned and went back to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the TV, my mind too restless to focus. At some point, Helen slipped into the room. She had gotten ready in the other bathroom and wore the silk nightgown she knew I liked. She hesitated before sitting at the edge of the bed, watching me for a moment. I didn't bother looking at her. I simply told her we wouldn't be sharing a bed and that she could sleep in Megan's old room or the guest room. She tried to speak, but I cut her off. There was nothing to talk about. I wasn't even sure we'd still be living under the same roof. Maybe she should have left with Tammy and Ted, but I hadn't made any decisions yet. Right now, I just needed space, away from her. Without another word, she left, settling into the guest room next door. Sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept me awake, and even when I dozed off, I woke up soon after. A few times during the night, I heard Helen crying softly. It didn't change anything. It didn't make me feel any better. Before dawn, I was up and out for a run. I needed the release, something to clear my mind, if only for a little while. By the time I returned, Helen had started moving around the apartment. I showered quickly, wanting to avoid her, but as I stepped out of the bathroom, I saw she had placed a cup of my usual coffee and a pastry at my spot at the table. Her voice was quiet as she spoke, reminding me how I always told my patients to eat after exercise. I stared at her in disbelief, barely keeping my anger in check. Did she really think coffee and a damn pastry would fix this? I told her not to worry about me, just like she hadn't worried about me for months while sneaking around with Ted. Then I walked out the door.
As soon as the door closed behind Hiram, I felt my legs give out beneath me. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of everything I had destroyed. Just yesterday, I had been preparing for Thanksgiving, thinking everything was fine. Now my marriage was crumbling and I had no idea how to fix it. I had hoped he would yell, that he would let his anger out and then we could talk, find a way forward. But the coldness in his voice, the way he looked at me like I was a stranger, it was worse than anything I had imagined. This wasn't going to pass quickly. This wasn't something I could smooth over. This was real. Hiram had to know how much I loved him. More than anyone. More than my family. More than even our daughter. He was my world. Flirting with Ted had meant nothing. I barely even thought about it until Hiram caught us. I had just been feeling old, less desirable. Hiram seemed to defy time, always staying fit, always looking sharp, while I saw myself fading. I had noticed how much attention he got from younger nurses and hospital workers, and deep down, I wanted that attention from him again. I wanted to feel wanted, but until yesterday I hadn't realized how much he still loved me. I saw it in his face, in the raw pain in his eyes. My own body had betrayed me these last few months. My hormones were out of control, my desire stronger than ever, but instead of reaching for my husband, I had withdrawn. Our bed life had never been a problem, but lately I felt self-conscious, hesitant. I told myself Hiram would notice, that he'd understand something was wrong, that he'd ask. But now I wondered if my distance had made him suspicious. Maybe he assumed I had been with Ted. But I hadn't. That was the truth. I had never slept with him. A few stolen moments, fleeting touches, nothing more. And yet, that was enough to ruin everything. The thought of what I had done, of what I might lose, sent a wave of nausea through me. I ran for the bathroom but didn't make it in time, gripping the sink as I threw up. My whole body shook. I rinsed my mouth, splashed cold water on my face, and dragged myself to bed. Maybe if I closed my eyes, if I stayed still long enough, the sickness would pass. But deep down, I knew this feeling wasn't going anywhere.
I arrived at my office earlier than usual, needing a distraction. A few patient appointments were scheduled, but my focus was elsewhere. The first call I made was to my lawyer, requesting a copy of our prenuptial agreement. Ironically, the document had originally been designed to protect Helen's assets. When we married, she was a successful real estate agent, while I was drowning in medical school debt with no established practice. The agreement ensured that in the event of a divorce, each of us would keep our own assets, with neither entitled to more than 20% of the other's net worth. Now, nearly 25 years later, things had flipped. My assets had grown to over $1 million, meaning Helen would walk away with no more than $200,000, enough for a while, but far from maintaining the lifestyle she was used to. If she didn't return to work, her financial situation would eventually decline, and who would hire her at 60? My next call was to the private investigator. Initially, I'd wanted to save our marriage, considering counseling to work through the betrayal. I loved Helen, but I wasn't naive. If she reconnected with Ted, there was a real chance she'd leave for good. Some of what she had said the night before stuck with me. Her insecurities, her hormones, feeling old and unwanted. Maybe she was battling depression. She spent most of her time at home, rarely going out except for shopping or the occasional dinner with me. She had no real purpose, no outlet beyond our marriage. I decided I would push her to volunteer at the hospital. Maybe working with elderly patients would help her feel youthful again, or spending time with children would give her energy. She needed something outside of me to give her life meaning. But regardless of her personal struggles, our marriage wasn't going to recover overnight. The sight of her still filled me with anger, and I knew that resentment would only grow if we stayed under the same roof. A separation, at least for a while, seemed inevitable. For the first time since we were married, we had slept in separate rooms. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. Later in the morning, Kelly called to check on me. She offered to meet for lunch, but I declined. I wasn't in the mood for company. I just wanted to bury myself in work. Michael Collins had already installed surveillance cameras throughout Hiram's apartment building, both staircases, the elevators, and the lobby. If Helen left, he'd see it. His real goal was to catch her in action, preferably outside the apartment, so he could slip in and plant additional recording devices. He had already wired her car the previous week, but nothing had turned up. He was beginning to suspect that Hiram was just another paranoid husband throwing money away on an unfounded suspicion. In his eyes, Helen wasn't exactly the type to attract a lover. She was aging, tired-looking. Hiram, on the other hand, acted like she was some rare, untouchable beauty. Maybe this is what love does to a man when he gets old, Collins thought. Then, luck struck. Helen finally left the apartment, looking even more disheveled than before, dressed in an outdated outfit with slippers. She didn't seem to be going far, giving Collins the perfect window to move. In under 15 minutes, he had hidden and activated 20 cameras inside the apartment, tapping both her home phone and cell. He left before she returned, avoiding any need for a cover story. Now all he had to do was wait.
I moved cautiously down the back stairs of the building, a place rarely used unless the elevators were out. In 15 years of living here, that had never happened. The dim lighting cast long shadows, making the descent feel even heavier. A few floors below, I saw them. 3 young men, familiar faces from the building. Tom and Henry had looked at Hiram strangely the day before. The third, Aaron, was their friend. I didn't hesitate. As I reached the landing, I ignored Tom's crude remark, stepping onto an old mattress discarded in the corner. They followed. Afterward, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing but emptiness. I thought of Hiram, of the devastation on his face when he found out about Ted. If he ever saw this, there would be no coming back. A lump formed in my throat as tears slid down my cheeks. The night before, I had slept just a few feet from Hiram, but it might as well have been miles. For over 2 decades, his soft snoring had been a comfort, a constant presence that reassured me. Without it, I had barely slept. Now, lying in the filth, I realized the truth. I still loved him, and I was on the verge of losing him forever. I had told myself this was about feeling wanted, proving to myself that I wasn't invisible, that youth hadn't completely slipped away from me. But Aaron's final, mocking words cut through that illusion. To them, I was nothing but a joke, a fleeting amusement. There was no admiration, no desire, just closeness. Shame burned through me. I had been a fool, chasing validation in the worst possible way. My marriage was falling apart, and I had only made it worse. A sharp pain twisted in my stomach, forcing me to sit back down. Something was wrong. After a moment, I gathered myself, pulled on my dress, and slowly climbed back up to the apartment. I needed to see Hiram, not as a doctor, but as my husband. Back home, I made tea and curled up on the couch with a warm towel pressed against my stomach. The painkillers dulled the ache, but my mind remained restless. I had to fix this. I couldn't lose him. I would do whatever it took to make Hiram the happiest man alive, to prove that the life we built was worth saving. Growing older didn't scare me. Growing old alone did. Determined, I decided to surprise him at lunch. The worst he could do was refuse to see me, but at least he'd know I was trying. As I pulled out of the parking lot, something caught my eye. A woman, wandering aimlessly down the street. She wasn't much older than me, but she looked lost, disconnected. She stopped to talk to people, but no one had time for her. A chill ran through me. I wasn't afraid of aging. I was afraid of becoming her. I watched a woman on a bench, lost in her thoughts as people passed by. She seemed disoriented, like she didn't know where she was going. It made me shudder, wondering if I could end up like that. Lost. Alone. But I quickly pushed the thought aside. Hiram loved me too much for that to happen. I needed to fix things, no matter what. I drove to Hiram's office, determined to make things right. When I walked through the lobby, no one even noticed me. It was like I wasn't there. I could see him through the glass, sitting at his desk with Kelly. They were having lunch together. I'd always suspected that Kelly had feelings for Hiram. She had been around for years, always a little too eager, a little too flirtatious. Now that things in our marriage weren't perfect, she was stepping in. I couldn't just let her take him. I walked into his office, forcing a smile, but my words were sharp. I made a jab at Kelly, trying to show her I wasn't backing down. Kelly smiled back, her tone sweet but venomous. The conversation felt like a battle I was already losing. I looked at Hiram, hoping for some sign that he'd defend me, but he said nothing. I left the office, my chest heavy with the weight of what I'd just witnessed. Hiram wasn't even trying to stop her. The drive home was a blur of tears. I could barely focus on the road. My hands gripped the wheel too tightly, and I had to pull over a few times to wipe my eyes. I've never been a good driver, but today I was even worse. I couldn't keep my thoughts straight. Hiram had always been the one who loved cars, who knew the ins and outs of every engine. He used to joke about buying an expensive sports car, but practicality always won out. Now I saw that part of him in me. Practical, holding everything together on the surface, but inside, falling apart. I'd been hiding things from Hiram, things I couldn't undo. The affair with the young men was eating at me. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal, one that I couldn't take back. Kelly, though, that was the real threat. She'd always been close to him, but now it was different. She was stepping in, taking advantage of the cracks in our marriage, and I was too afraid, too ashamed to stop it. I thought about Megan, how she hadn't called me today. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, distracting me as I drove. Suddenly, I slammed on the brakes to avoid crashing into the car in front of me. The driver behind me honked angrily, and I heard insults thrown my way. Stupid old woman. Get a license. I felt them all, each word sinking deeper than the last. I was unraveling, and I couldn't seem to stop it. My guilt, my vanity, everything I'd hidden from Hiram, it was all coming to the surface, and I didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't just afraid of getting older. I was terrified of being alone. And in that moment, I realized I might already be too late. I had always taken pride in my beauty, believing I was a modern Helen of Troy. My looks had drawn attention everywhere I went, and I had built a successful real estate career partly because of it. Men wanted to buy from me, not just for the properties, but for the fantasy that they could win me over. But by the time Hiram came into my life, I had begun noticing the first signs of aging. The fine lines around my eyes, the subtle loss of youth. It terrified me. My friends thought I was settling, choosing a serious, bookish young doctor instead of someone more exciting. But I knew better. Hiram didn't see me as just a beautiful woman. He saw my potential, my future. While others imagined me undressed, he imagined a life with me. That's why I had ignored their warnings and married him. He had spent years devoted to me, working tirelessly to build our life together. He talked endlessly about the future we would share, the places we would visit, the retirement we would plan. I had been his whole world, and I had thrown it all away. Hiram never boasted, never sought attention, but I always knew what mattered most to him. It had always been two things: me and that damn car. I had never thought about it before, but it was clear now. His passion was his wife and his Mustang. Mine had been my vanity and my fear of being alone. While Hiram's love drove him to build a future for us, my insecurity pushed me into the arms of others. I needed to know I was still desired, still attractive, still wanted. But had that been so wrong? Over the years, my old friends had faded away. The women who once partied with me had disappeared as soon as I settled into marriage and motherhood. We had nothing in common anymore. I had become the center of one person's world, while they continued seeking validation in bars and clubs. The last time I saw them had been at a funeral. It had been a harsh reality check. Most of them looked like they had barely survived their hard-lived lives. Aging had not been kind to them. Some were nearly unrecognizable, frail and toothless. It had been a relief to know I had made the right choice, leaving that life behind. But their words that day still haunted me. They had barely remembered Hiram, mocking the idea that I had ever been interested in him. They had assumed I had moved on to someone better, someone more exciting, and now, after all these years, I had proven them right. I had been a fool. I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to calm my nerves before getting back on the road. The close call from earlier still rattled me, and I needed the other drivers I had nearly crashed into to move far away before I attempted to drive again. On impulse, I called Megan. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried the home phone instead. After a few rings, Nick answered. Before I could even say hello, his voice was cold. He told me not to call them for a while. Panic surged through me. "Where was Megan?" I demanded. He hesitated for a moment, then told me she was there, but she didn't want to talk to me. And then he hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. My own daughter had turned away from me. Megan had never been particularly close to her father, but now she was choosing him over me. My sister was furious with me. My mother barely existed in my life anymore. And now, even my daughter was shutting me out. And in the middle of it all, I was on the verge of losing Hiram. The very thing I had feared the most, being alone, was happening right before my eyes. My heart pounded as I gripped the steering wheel. This couldn't be real. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Shaking, I started the car and pulled into traffic without thinking, without checking my mirrors. The impact was sudden. A sharp crunch of metal and plastic as another car slammed into mine. Shouts erupted around me. The driver behind me was cursing, furious, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look. I just kept driving. I needed to get home.
I finished my last appointment of the day, wrapping up paperwork and signing bonus checks for my staff. It was something I did every holiday season, but today it felt mechanical, meaningless. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by everything that had happened with Helen. The phone rang, an internal hospital number. I answered without much thought, expecting a routine patient update. But the moment I heard the voice on the other end, everything stopped. My hands went numb, the pen slipped from my grip, and the phone clattered onto the desk. Helen had been rushed to the hospital. Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and left. Nothing else mattered in that moment. The weight of our problems, the anger, the betrayal, it all faded. I needed to get to her. On the way, I called Tammy. She was hesitant to talk to me after everything, still dealing with her own pain, but I told her what had happened. Despite her anger, she agreed to meet me at the hospital. I called Megan next. Her response was colder. She questioned why I even cared after what Helen had done. I had to ask her as a personal favor. I hated the way that sounded, as though I was using my role in her life to guilt her into coming. But I also knew that if this was serious, Helen would want her there. When I arrived at the hospital, I learned Helen had already been moved from the ER to the ICU. I barely made it out of the elevator before running into Dr. Elliott. His expression sent a wave of dread through me. For a moment, I thought she was gone, but she wasn't, at least not physically. Elliott explained she would recover, but emotionally, this would be devastating. Then came the real shock. Helen had been pregnant. The baby hadn't survived. The news hit like a punch to the gut. At her age, a pregnancy was nearly impossible. Then Elliott mentioned something even more unsettling, bruises from earlier that morning, as if she and I had been together. But I hadn't touched her. Confusion turned to ice-cold clarity. As Elliott spoke, my gaze drifted down the hall, locking onto a familiar figure trying to stay out of sight. Ted. Everything fell into place. I kept my voice calm, steady, asking for a DNA test on the fetus. Tammy and Megan followed my line of sight, their own realizations dawning. Tammy's disgust was immediate. If Ted was the father, she wanted him gone. Megan, struggling to process it all, wondered aloud if her mother had tried to sleep with her husband too. I had no answers for her. Instead, I turned and walked straight to the nurse's station, asking which room Helen was in. When I stepped inside, she looked nothing like the woman I had known for over 2 decades. She was fragile, exhausted, broken. I reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. She flinched at first, then turned to me, eyes full of fear and regret. She was searching for anger, for blame, expecting the worst. But I wasn't sure if I had anything left to give. She tried to speak, but I stopped her. None of it mattered right now. Whatever had happened, whatever truths we would have to face, it could wait. Right now, she needed to get better. As she drifted into sleep, I sat beside her, holding her hand, unsure of what came next. When I left the room, Kelly was waiting. She had heard I was at the hospital. Without a word, she stepped forward and hugged me, holding on tightly. I didn't move. I didn't speak. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what to do. I walked down to the hospital lab with Kelly, knowing the test results were ready. I had spent over an hour by Helen's bedside, giving them enough time to run multiple tests. When I finally saw the results, my breath came out slow and measured, my mind processing what was in front of me. Ted wasn't the father, but neither was I. The truth settled in like a weight I couldn't shake. I turned to Ted, cold and detached, telling him to go home to his wife and not make the same mistake again. He said nothing, just lowered his head and left. Kelly and I drove back in silence. Once home, I went straight to my office, shutting the door behind me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I accessed the security footage. I searched through hours of recordings from inside the apartment and Helen's car. Nothing unusual, just her struggling to drive, which wasn't what I was looking for. Then I found it, a file labeled BS3, back staircase, 3rd floor. My pulse quickened as I clicked play. At first, it was just a group of young men, ones I had seen loitering around the building, laughing, shoving each other, smoking. Then Helen appeared. My stomach twisted into knots. What I saw next made my vision blur, my hands tremble, my breathing grow uneven. I slammed the pause button, unable to look any further. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process it. This was beyond anything I had imagined. I had already been hit with one painful revelation after another, but this shattered whatever was left. 25 years of marriage, destroyed in mere hours. A noise at the door snapped me back to reality. Kelly stepped inside, her voice filled with concern. She had never seen me like this before. Somewhere in the wreckage of my thoughts, a plan started to form. I told her I needed help. She agreed without hesitation. On the drive back to the hospital, I made calls, transferring most of my patients to other doctors. For the first time in my career, my practice could wait. Right now, only one patient mattered. When I reached Helen's room, she was surprised to see me still there. I sat beside her waiting, staying long after visiting hours ended. Over the next few days, I remained by her side, barely leaving. Even she was startled by my absence from work. She spoke cautiously, guilt weighing down every word. She had always wanted proof that I loved her, and now she saw it, but too late. Over the years, she had measured love by grand gestures, by romance from movies and fairy tales. But the real proof had always been there, in the way I had stayed, in the life we had built, in the quiet commitment of over 2 decades. She had taken it for granted, and now she saw what she had lost. I refused to bring up what had happened. Whenever she tried, I cut her off, insisting she needed to focus on recovering. She began crafting excuses, thinking of ways to explain away what she had done, but I didn't press her. I'd already seen the truth. She hadn't spoken to her sister or daughter since she arrived at the hospital, though she had been told they had come on the first day. She finally tried calling Tammy, but the call went unanswered. When she tried again, Ted picked up and immediately hung up on her. Megan was next. The number had been disconnected. She tried again with her daughter's cell. Same result. Helen started to panic. 3 weeks in the hospital had left her desperate to go home. She learned she had been cleared for discharge earlier, but I had convinced the doctors to keep her another week. She wanted to return to our bed, believing that if we could just go back to our life, we could move past everything. She had convinced herself we could fix this. For weeks, I had been there, the only one left, the one she had hurt the most. Yet I was still by her side. And if that wasn't love, she didn't know what was. I waited in the lobby, my nerves steady but my focus sharp. The plan was in motion. A call came in, confirmation that everything was set. I walked to the front stairs, casually tossing a plastic bag onto the steps while pretending to check my mail. Moments later, Tom appeared, his attention drawn to the bag. Without hesitation, I exited through the back and made my way to Kelly's floor. As I disappeared, Tom picked up the bag, finding it filled with hospital-grade pills alongside several illegal substances. Before he could process what he was holding, 2 police cars pulled up. Officers swarmed, tools drawn. Within seconds, Tom was in handcuffs, shoved into the back of a squad car. Kelly and I watched from above. She wrapped her arms around me, her silent support more reassuring than words. 2 days later, Aaron spotted Kelly taking the back stairs, the same route Helen had once used. His mind instantly went to the past, reminiscing about how easily Helen had let them do whatever they wanted. He figured this was another opportunity and decided to follow her. Kelly entered an apartment on the 2nd floor, one that wasn't hers. Curious, Aaron peeked inside just before the door closed, his eyes widening at the sight. Expensive electronics stacked neatly in the closet. Before he could think too much about it, Kelly lifted her skirt slightly, then walked out, forgetting to lock the door behind her. Aaron trailed her upstairs where she met me. She kissed me, then disappeared into my apartment, shutting the door. Aaron smirked, convinced now that Helen's affair made sense. No wonder she had slept around. Her husband had the best-looking woman in the building, and she must have felt overlooked. But he wasn't interested in their drama. He rushed back to the 2nd floor apartment, finding the door still ajar. Once inside, he eyed a DVD player and a small plasma TV. Then his gaze landed on something even better, a Glock 9mm pistol lying on the table. Grinning, he picked it up, testing its weight. The clip was full. He admired the Colt, whispering to himself as he imagined showing it off. His friends would be jealous. Before he could pocket it, a voice thundered through the room, orders, loud and unmistakable. He turned, heart pounding. 4 officers stood at the entrance, Colts aimed. Within minutes, he was arrested and booked for trespassing, possession of an unregistered tool, and linked to a string of thefts in the building. His future was sealed. As for Henry, he had already been dealt with. Someone had knocked him out cold and dumped him onto a freight train headed out of state. When he woke, he found a $20 bill and a note warning him never to return, unless he wanted to suffer a worse fate than his friends. Meanwhile, Helen remained oblivious. She assumed something was wrong with her phone when she couldn't reach Megan, Tammy, or even the boys she had been involved with. She refused to believe they had all suddenly changed their numbers or stopped paying their bills. But her focus had shifted. There was one real obstacle between her and fixing her marriage: Kelly. Helen convinced herself that if Kelly stepped aside, she and I could rebuild. First, she planned to appeal to Kelly directly, reminding her of the struggles her own parents had faced before reconciling. If that failed, Helen was prepared to turn to the boys, believing Tom, Aaron, and Henry could intimidate Kelly into leaving. That was no longer an option. Helen had made up her mind. Nothing and no one would stand between her and keeping our marriage together. She planned to confront Kelly before leaving the hospital because she was finally being discharged on Christmas Day. The timing felt symbolic, almost like fate handing her a second chance. After nearly a month without intimacy, she knew exactly what gift she wanted to give me. I had been preparing the house for her return, dropping hints about gifts and surprises. She expected either a jewelry box or travel tickets, predictable, but still meaningful. But more than any gift, Helen wanted a fresh start. She had convinced herself that if we just sat down and talked, we could move forward. She even thought about confessing some of the truth. Not everything, just enough to frame it in a way that would make forgiveness possible. If I found out in the future, at least it wouldn't seem like she had been lying all along. Now, while I was still concerned about her health and more willing to forgive, was the time to secure our future. At least, that's what she believed. I waited in the hospital lobby while Helen, unaware of what was coming, asked a nurse if Kelly could visit. The response surprised her. Kelly had quit. Helen likely took it as a victory, assuming I had chosen to work things out with her, forcing Kelly to walk away. That evening, I visited briefly, telling her I had a patient, but would see her later or in the morning when she was discharged. She pried about Christmas plans, subtly checking if Kelly was still around. I gave short answers, watching as she tried to mask her satisfaction. When I kissed her goodbye, it wasn't on the lips, but on the forehead. To her, it probably felt like progress. I didn't go to the hospital. Helen was discharged at 9 a.m., given instructions for recovery. With no mention of restrictions, she took it as a sign that everything was falling back into place. Assuming I was delayed with a patient, she saw it as proof that life was returning to normal. Confident, she called a taxi home. As she stepped into the building, the sight of families celebrating filled her with relief. She convinced herself she had escaped disaster, believing I had only uncovered part of the truth. Losing Tammy and Megan hurt, but if it meant saving our marriage, she could accept it. Curious, she stopped by Kelly's apartment. The door was sealed with plastic, the kind used for vacated units. Kelly hadn't just left her job, she had moved. Helen saw it as a perfect reset. She entered our apartment expecting warmth and holiday decorations. Instead, she was met with a cold, empty space. There was no Christmas tree, no festive lights, just a sad, worn-out tabletop tree barely standing. A single garland hung across the mantel, its lights flickering before going out completely. Then she saw the gifts on the bed, 3 large boxes and a note. The note instructed her to open each box in order. The first contained her hospital discharge papers and a pile of medical bills. Confused, she moved to the second. Inside were legal documents, including our prenuptial agreement. Her hands shook as she recognized what it meant. Desperation set in as she tore open the last, smallest box. No jewelry, no sign of reconciliation, just a single DVD. Her stomach dropped. She rushed to play it, her hands unsteady as the screen flickered on. The footage was undeniable. There she was, with them. The reality was stark, raw, and far from the version she had created in her mind. There was nothing alluring, nothing secretive or exciting. She looked desperate, ruined. Bile rose in her throat, but the video wasn't over. The screen shifted. Now it was me, sitting in my office, adjusting the camera, staring straight ahead. She barely processed it. Still shaken, still convincing herself this was some twisted way of proving I had forgiven her. Then I spoke. I thanked her. Not for love, not for the years we spent together, but for finally showing me who she really was. And with that, everything she had told herself, every lie, every excuse, shattered. This wasn't a second chance. It was the end. I had once believed our marriage could be salvaged. Even after Thanksgiving, despite my anger and betrayal, I had been willing to try. If Helen had simply stayed away from Ted, I thought we might have found a way forward. But I had deceived myself, just as she had deceived me. Trust was shattered. There was no fixing it. I had installed cameras in the apartment, a decision that ultimately confirmed what I had feared. There was no future for us. The video had said it all. There was no coming back from that. I had already filed for divorce and moved on. According to our prenuptial agreement, she was entitled to 20% of my net worth. I transferred $200,000 into our former joint account, which now belonged solely to her. Every credit card in our names had been canceled. She would need to start over. I wanted no part of our old life, not in that apartment or that building. It held too many memories, and I planned to create new ones. Whatever she did next was no longer my concern. Her hospital stay hadn't been fully covered by insurance, and she would soon receive a bill for the final 3 weeks, roughly $35,000. That wasn't my problem either. A private investigator had also come looking for her regarding a hit and run. She had fled the scene of an accident, and now the consequences had caught up. Before the screen went black, Kelly appeared beside me, settling into my lap. She kissed me, turned to the camera with a knowing smile, and waved. Helen sat frozen, realizing she had lost everything. A knock at the door jolted her back. Expecting Megan or Tammy, she opened it to find 2 police officers. She was being arrested. The hit and run had finally caught up with her. She spent Christmas in jail. With no one else to call, she tried Tammy, but the number had changed. Desperate, she called me. I didn't answer. Kelly did. Her voice was sweet, almost taunting. She casually mentioned that we were celebrating Christmas at Tammy's house with Megan, Nick, and my grandson. She hinted at wanting children of her own, and joked that I had better hurry before she got too old. Helen was silent, listening to the realization sink in. Before hanging up, Kelly added one final blow. Ted and I were talking again. Now that Helen was out of the picture, there was nothing left to fight over. Helen held the phone, staring into emptiness. She had been a fool, and now she had nothing. Days passed, and I felt an emptiness lingering, but I refused to dwell on it. Kelly had been by my side through it all, offering support, giving me the strength to move forward. Over time, I stopped seeing her as just a young colleague. She became something more, a woman who truly cared, who never wavered. Months later, I made a choice. I sold my share of the clinic, left the city, and started over with Kelly. A clean slate, a new life. Helen, meanwhile, faced the reality of her downfall. She received a suspended sentence, but returned to an empty apartment, a shell of the life she had once known. She tried to reconnect with Megan and Tammy, but neither wanted anything to do with her. She was alone. The weight of regret settled deep. The walls around her became reminders of all she had lost. She turned to faith, hoping for redemption. Church became a refuge, a place to search for meaning, but prayers couldn't erase the past. Years passed. I built a new life, married Kelly, and had children. We found happiness, stability, a future. Helen remained in the past, alone but searching for purpose. She began working at a homeless shelter, giving back in the only way she could. It didn't undo her mistakes, but it gave her something to hold on to. For me, Helen's story was a lesson. Love and loyalty should never be taken for granted. I had learned to cherish those who stood by me, to embrace the present instead of clinging to what was already broken. Helen, in the end, could only hope that one day those she had hurt would forgive her. Until then, all she had was time.